First referenced in Fallout 3, synths are arguably one of the most important aspects to the story of Fallout 4. Indeed, the entire reason the sole survivor even escaped the vault and left their undetermined mark on the Commonwealth was due to the synths. The Institute, unsatisfied with their clunky Gen 2 models, went in search of pure, untainted human DNA from pre-war residents. To this end, they infiltrated Vault 111 to capture Sean, who provided the blueprint for synths we see throughout the game. Synths are the primary motivator for 3 out of the 4 of the factions that can be sided with. Each are motivated by different goals, but the underlying key denominator is their own individual views on synths. The Railroad view synths as free-thinking sentient beings who need to be saved from enslavement. In their eyes, there's absolutely no difference between a synth and a human. The Institute believes synths to be merely a tool to be used and discarded of when it's outlived its purpose. In their mind, a synth is no different to a computer terminal or a blender. The only difference is they view synths as much more valuable property. The Brotherhood of Steel openly believe that the threat the synths pose is as dangerous, if not more so, than the atomic weapons that destroyed the world they inhabit. A free-thinking machine that believes it is alive is in their eyes an abomination. Synths inspire incredibly emotional responses to their existence from these factions. Our choices as the player ourselves on which faction to side with is undeniably inspired on our own personal view on synths and artificial intelligence. This in itself has led to the polarizing view from players across the series, the most obvious being, do synths have free will? Firstly, free will is identified as the capacity of agents to choose between different possible courses of actions unimpeded. And even in our own real world, debates range in philosophy and religion if free will even truly exists. Therefore, the decision we might reach on the question is obviously going to differ based on our own intrinsic worldview. I do want to make a point, however, that the question is not if synths are human. They aren't. Biologically, they're similar, but they're a uniquely different species from humanity. Instead, the main focus is on the idea of synths, despite being grown artificially in a lab, do or do not possess their own sense of self and free will. Even within the Institute, arguments rage on the belief in the autonomy and free will of synths. Robotics head Alan Binet is noted as unique in his belief that synths are more akin to a human being than many realize. He even states that the evolution of synths gaining artificial intelligence is accomplishing the goal of the Institute itself, to redefine mankind.
Involuntary twitching and rapid eye movements while sleeping can only mean one thing, Max. If a synth can dream, why can't it have a soul? And if a synth has a soul, then it is a living person by every standard we can measure.
So passionate in his belief, Alan comes into friction with colleagues at the Institute. A conversation with an SRB scientist shows Alan rejecting the premise that the increase of reported autonomy in Gen 3 synths are malfunctions. He's also seen to chastise his friend regarding his live-in companion Synth Eve, asking him to call her a her rather than it. However, Alan's view on the free will of synths is quite uncommon within the Institute, with 99% believing instead that synths are merely machines. Father, the director of the Institute, acknowledges the advanced nature of a synth's mind, but disregards the notion of autonomy out of hand.
The superior synth mind and body attempting to wrestle with something approaching free will can be a recipe for chaos.
The Railroad also evidently have their own beliefs on the free will of synths. However, there is some division within the organization itself.
Everyone wants to liberate the Gen 3s, the human-looking synths. Some of the synths in the Railroad, like Glory, think we should help earlier models too. But Gen 1s are basically the same as, well, a protectron, so the line gets muddy. Do we defend AI rights? Terminals? Hell, turrets?
For her part, Glory does state outright that she doesn't believe synths are human. Instead, her worldview was based on the idea that synths are entirely separate from human beings, but also that they do possess their own free will. If contested, Glory indicates that arguing that a synth has no free will opens the door to stating that a human being doesn't either.
So do you think we're just machines? If we are, then take a long look in the mirror. Maybe you're just running your brain's goddamn programming.
As such, the answer to the question varies dramatically within the game, depending on who we communicate with. Our largest exposure to synths does come from 2 of the companions that are able to join us on our journeys, Nick Valentine and Curie. In their communications with us, both display a sense of autonomy and free agency, which is difficult to ascribe to simple malfunctions in code. Nick Valentine is a prototype synth that was implanted with the memories of a pre-war detective by the name of Nick Valentine. However, despite taking his name and having access to the former's memory, the synth Nick Valentine does not consider himself to be a continuation of the original. The implanted memories have helped to shape his worldview, namely his skill in detective work, yet despite this, he has his own distinct personality and identity of his own. Nick is one of the most empathetic characters within the game. He has a keen grasp of right and wrong, and strives to champion the cause of good in a world where evil can take you very far. Even when defeating enemies ideologically opposed to him, namely the Brotherhood of Steel or the Institute, Nick mourns their loss of life. In the reverse, he even holds hatred in his vendetta to kill Eddie Winters for the actions against his pre-war counterpart. Nick is obviously influenced by the implanted memories in his brain. You could argue that his tendency to fight for what is right is in keeping with his code, rather than a sense of independent altruism. Sadly, one of the ways we could know for certain if Nick is following the prompts of his pre-war memories or acting on his own independent thought is when Nick loses his memory. Since he is a prototype synth, his memory storage has limited space, and so he will one day lose access to all of his previous stored memory, both the implanted and the earned. It could be argued that if this new forgotten Valentine continued his quest for good, then this was his own independent action the whole time. Then again, you could also state that this is just his code continuing to pull the strings, and he'd only be considered to have free will potentially if he went on a murderous rampage. Basically, Nick's is hard to determine since he's a synth with the memories of a human implanted into him. In fact, the whole argument is super hard to determine, but we'll move on to our next example, Curie. Curie's example is interesting as she was legitimately a Miss Handy robot assigned to Vault 3 to assist the science team. Now, robots themselves are evident to have a level of self-determination. Codworth states that before being united with the sole survivor, the thoughts of love and kindness from the family were the only thing that kept him from going insane. Curie herself was upgraded, however, by the Vault 3 scientists with personality settings from a variety of different sources. This enabled her to begin to learn and develop to the point that there was little distinguishing her from any other normal human being. One of the scientists, Dr. Collins, surmised her development as such. Curie has been a remarkable success. She transcended my expectations of robotic programming. Her personality feels as genuine as my own. Her interest in scientific research is insatiable, and seeing her struggle with concepts like mortality has been completely moving. Truly, she is my greatest work. I only hope that one day she can see more of the world. If only I could be there to witness her reaction to the blue skies and the butterflies she's only heard me sing about. Despite her depth of personality, Curie was still restricted to her programming. She required the sole survivor to grant her permission to leave the lab and override the loophole. As a robot, Curie is self-aware enough to understand the limitations placed on her current form. She therefore requests the sole survivor to transplant her consciousness into a synth body in order to experience the full array of being, to then expand her understanding of the world. This does open a complex question on the nature of what constitutes a sense of self or free will. Curie, as a robot, deactivates and uploads her databanks of knowledge. These are then transplanted into the brain of a synth who'd been left in a vegetative state after a memory wipe went wrong. The robot of Curie falls to the ground, empty and lifeless, and the body of the previous synth awakens, now with the consciousness of Curie within. In the seconds between when the databanks were uploaded and when the synth Curie woke, all that was left of Curie herself was code uploaded to the memory den's data storage. She physically ceased to be, albeit for a relatively short period of time. And when she awakens, it raises the question of if this is technically the same Curie we had known, or if it's a new entity with the memories of Curie, similar to how Nick is a being with the memories of the original Nick Valentine. And even if their soul, if we might classify it as, is merely computer storage and memory, is that so different from a human being's? In an attempt to locate the Institute, Nick has a cybernetic brain augmentation that had previously been attached to Kellogg's brain inserted in order to access his memories. However, a part of Kellogg's consciousness is still embedded within the device, as he speaks through Nick one last time.
Hope you got what you were looking for inside my head. I was right. I should have killed you when you were on ice.
Kellogg still existed, even with his physical body dead, within the cybernetic augmentation. So if you took a regular human being and placed their brain inside that of a synth, do they stop becoming a person? Do they stop possessing free will? Biologically, their body is that of a synth. It won't age. They won't require sustenance to survive. They won't need to remove bodily waste ever again. But the brain, whether it be original or copy, with its memory transplanted, would still hold within it the very individual from before, a thinking being occupying a vessel different to its original. There are a multitude of other examples of synths showing independent thought and free will. Dance didn't even know he was one, and signed up with the one organisation dedicated to destroying his creators, which was probably a dumb idea if that was what he was programmed to do. Yes, he could have been a double agent, but the Institute didn't even have a record of him. Gabriel went from a meek, docile synth to the leader of a raider gang. Glory joined the Railroad to liberate the synths. X-88, although not really having a choice, seems to genuinely enjoy the work he does as a Courser, and shows signs of respect and affection to the sole survivor. Chase and Harkness, in contrast, willingly gave up their life of a Courser to live as free beings, one with the memory and one without. Magnolia even wrote a catalogue of songs, music that never had existed in the world prior to being formulated by the mind of an artificial creation. So many examples, and yet we still don't really have an answer. I personally would like to think that synths possess free will and independent thought. However, I am aware that I extend this opinion only to the human-looking Gen 3s, and not the mannequin-esque Gen 2s or robotic Gen 1s. Even if synths do not possess their own sense of self and free will, but had an indistinguishably advanced AI, I believe it would be altruistic and right to treat them as such. Essentially, if something can say to you, hey, I'm a free-thinking, independent being, please don't enslave me in your subterranean science lair to do manual labour for the rest of my existence, I want to leave this place, I'd say it's probably wrong to continue to enslave them.